In the shadow of a silent volcano, trust was tested, paths were blocked, and careful observation became a matter of safety. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century, tracing encounters that were often cautious, uncertain, and shaped as much by distance as by contact. The narrative is based on Forster's travel report, translated and adapted into modern English and accompanied by historical and scientific context where it helps illuminate what is observed and what remains out of reach. In this episode, the expedition continues its exploration of the island of Tanna in today's Vanuatu, moving through a landscape of volcanic ground, guarded paths, and encounters that never quite become meetings. What happened in the last episode?
In the previous episode, the expedition explored the volcanic interior of Tanna, studying steaming vents, fertile soil, and the island's remarkable plant life shaped by volcanic ash. Careful measurements and botanical work alternated with uneasy guidance from the islanders, who repeatedly diverted the Europeans from sensitive areas. Moments of hospitality, rich fishing grounds, and growing familiarity stood alongside warnings, misdirection, and the realization that access to the island would always remain controlled.
Sunday, August 14th, 1774, Island of Tanna, Vanuatu.
The next morning, Captain Cook, Mr. Wales, Mr. Patton, Dr. Sparman, Georg's father, Georg himself, and several other curious men, accompanied by 2 sailors, set out for the volcano on the western side of the bay. The weather was misty, the air humid, but the volcano showed no activity. Before long, they reached the solfatara, where hot steam rose in thick clouds. To measure the temperature, they repeated the experiment from the day before. This time, they buried the thermometer completely in the white clay from which the steam emerged. After 1 minute, it showed 99 degrees Celsius, 210 degrees Fahrenheit, almost the temperature of boiling water. During the 5 minutes it remained in the ground, the reading stayed constant. Once they removed the thermometer, the temperature dropped instantly to 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, then gradually down to 27 degrees Celsius, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, its initial reading before the test.
The smoking vents, described as a solfatara, were a familiar phenomenon to European naturalists, though their causes were still imperfectly understood. A solfatara is an area where volcanic gases escape through the ground, releasing heat, sulfurous vapors, and mineral deposits. In the 18th century, such phenomena were often explained through theories of underground fermentation, burning minerals, and chemical reactions taking place beneath the surface of the earth. Forster's attempt to account for heat, fumes, and altered vegetation reflects this contemporary scientific framework. Rather than dismissing these explanations as incorrect, it is important to see them as early effects to understand volcanic processes before the development of modern geology. Observations like these contributed to a growing awareness that the Earth was dynamic, shaped by internal forces as well as surface erosion.
The Solfatara lay about 73 meters above sea level. Continuing uphill, they found several patches of cleared forest and areas prepared for planting, together amounting to about half a hectare. As they had seen a few days earlier, this must have cost the islanders considerable time and effort. They passed several huts but encountered no one until they met a lone man in a well-kept plantation, busy planting yams. The unexpected meeting startled him at first, but when he heard the visitors were merely looking for the path to the volcano, he quickly calmed down. He pointed out a trail that was supposed to lead there and returned to his work without further concern. By the huts, they saw a few pigs and chickens roaming freely. Presumably for this reason, the villagers had fenced off their fields with hedges and enclosures. A little farther up, they met two men coming from a nearby banana grove. These joined them, and together they reached a fork in the trail. On one of the paths, which led deeper inland, stood a local man who raised his spear and forbade them to proceed. When they explained that they only wished to reach the volcano, he replied, "Then you must take the other path," and walked ahead himself. As they followed, he kept turning around to count how many they were. After a while, they reached an open space with a wide view over the land. It became clear that he had deliberately led them astray. Despite all his gestures, they turned back, realizing his deception had been discovered and that he was not strong enough alone to act. He resorted to another method. He blew through his hollow hand as if on a horn. From different sides of the mountain came responses, signals from Triton shells. Hearing this, he shouted to those nearby how many foreigners there were, likely to ensure that his fellow islanders could gather in sufficient numbers and arm themselves. Meanwhile, Georg and the others had gotten lost again. They came upon a beautiful, secluded valley surrounded by tall, shady trees. There, many doves and parrots were resting, and they managed to shoot several of them. The sound of the gunfire soon attracted a few locals, including some boys. They tried to win the visitors over with gifts, and succeeded. The children let them pass along a narrow path winding through dense, dark undergrowth. At the end, they reached an open area where 3 or 4 large huts stood, roughly the size of the dwellings of old Pauvjangom. 10 to 12 men, well armed with bows, arrows, clubs, and spears, were sitting in a row near the houses. As soon as they saw the strangers, they sprang to their feet. Georg and his companions waved and made gestures to show they meant no harm. The older men responded peacefully, while 2 or 3 of the younger ones frowned and brandished their weapons. It could easily have been taken as a challenge, but instead of provoking anything, they asked for directions back to the beach. This had an immediate effect. 2 men volunteered as guides and led them along a narrow path that was very steep at first, but soon became easier. After about 400 meters of descent, the guides suggested a rest. As soon as they sat down, others from the huts arrived, carrying coconuts, bananas, and a large quantity of sugar cane. Given the oppressive heat, these refreshments were very welcome. Georg and the others expressed their gratitude with various gifts. It now became clear that the Tanese had only tried to stop them out of mistrust, not true hostility. After about half an hour, they returned to the area of the beach from which they had set out in the morning. Thus ended this short journey, which, had they acted with less caution, could easily have caused harm both to themselves and to the locals, without any incident. Their goal of inspecting the volcano more closely had been thwarted, and there was no indication that future attempts would succeed. But reason and justice demand that curiosity be bounded, when it cannot be satisfied without injustice or bloodshed. During their absence, the ship's crew had cast the net at high tide and caught a small number of fish, including one previously unknown species. In a freshwater pool, they had also found a new kind of fish and several swamp eels. They brought this haul, along with the plants gathered on the mountain, back on board and spent the afternoon drawing and describing them. The next morning, they set out again for a botanical excursion. The trade in yams and weapons continued, but tortoiseshell had become so rare on the ship that almost no food could be traded for it. Pearl shell fish hooks, common on the Friendly Islands, were in high demand and were often exchanged for a whole handful of arrows, especially if the hook included a piece of tortoiseshell. Another hook of the same quality, but made only from pearl shell, was barely appreciated. They wandered through the forests of the lowlands, shooting various birds. There was a great diversity of species on the island. They also found several East Indian plants that had not yet appeared on the more easterly islands. The most valuable find was a dove, exactly the kind often seen on the Friendly Islands. This one had a reddish substance stuck to the outside of its beak, and, as they found when they opened it, 2 nutmegs in its crop. These must have been swallowed recently, as they were still covered by their scarlet husks. That husk is what's known as mace. It tasted bitter and spicy, but without any aroma. The nut itself was slightly more elongated in shape than usual, but in flavor, it differed little from true nutmeg. They showed the nutmegs to one of the first locals they met, and offered him a piece of pearl shell as a reward if he would show them the tree they came from. The man led them about 800 meters inland and finally pointed to a young tree trunk, claiming it to be a nutmeg tree. They plucked a few leaves from it, but found no fruit. According to the man, the doves didn't let the nuts hang long. In his language, he called the nut guanatan. While speaking with him, they suddenly heard several loud musket shots. This made them fear a conflict had broken out between their men and the islanders. A local passing by from the beach said something they didn't fully understand, but it seemed to confirm their concern. So they hurried back to the coast. But there, all was calm. No incident had occurred. The leaves they believed to be from a nutmeg tree were not recognized as such by any of the islanders gathered on the beach. On the contrary, all of them gave the plant a name different from the one their guide had used. When he realized the researchers were about to expose his deception, he gestured to his countrymen to give the plant the same name as his own. But Georg and his companions quickly made it clear how strongly they disapproved of his behavior. The man also faced pointed criticism from the other islanders. In the afternoon, Captain Cook set out for the eastern hill, along with Lieutenants Cooper and Pickersgill, Mr. Patton, Mr. Hodges, Dr. Sparman, Georg's father, and Georg himself. They passed through gardens and plantations until they reached the beach on the far side. Cook mainly wanted to catch sight of Anatom Island from there. However, it was shrouded in thick fog, so they had to turn back almost empty-handed. On the way, they shot some birds and happened to arrive at the homes of their friendly hosts. The father of the little girl Georg had mentioned earlier brought him bananas, sugarcane, and coconuts as a gift, further reinforcing Georg's positive impression of the man's warmth. Mr. Hodges made several drawings of the landscape during the excursion, especially one sketch of a small homestead, where a group of men and women sat in the grass beneath the shaded branches of a fig tree. This sketch later served as the basis for a painting that accurately depicted both the scenery and the local people. By sunset, they returned to the ship by boat. The next morning they once again set out, walking across the plain and into the forest. There they encountered many large parrots with feathers speckled in black, red, and yellow. But the birds stayed high in the treetops of the massive fig trees, out of reach of their shotguns due to the height and dense foliage. The sheer size of these trees was almost unimaginable. Their roots typically protruded above the ground, forming the base of the trunk 3 to 4 meters above the earth. Such a trunk often measured nearly 3 meters in diameter and appeared to consist of several fused trees with long, sharp-edged ridges, about 30 centimeters wide all around. In this shape, the tree rose 10 to 12 meters before splitting into branches, each at least a meter thick. These branches extended another 10 to 12 meters before dividing into smaller twigs. Altogether, the crown of the tree reached a height of roughly 45 meters. These trees were most commonly found in a swampy area where the pond lay from which they drew drinking water for the ship. Whether this pond marked the end of a river descending from the island's mountainous region, losing itself in the volcanic slag of the plain, or whether it had formed solely from summer rains, they could not determine for sure. They did, however, notice that the area was teeming with mosquitoes, which tormented them as they hunted rails and ducks. These birds were also foraging in the swamp. Unfortunately, they failed to shoot even one, despite their likely scientific value as previously unknown species. Due to the meager hunting results, they continued westward. There they came across several meadows covered with grass and separated by various types of brush, almost like English meadows with living hedges. Between these fields were large tracts of tall reed grass, Saccharum spontaneum, which the islanders used for arrows, fences, baskets, and other woven goods. Judging by its abundance, the reed didn't appear to grow wild, but rather seemed to have been deliberately cultivated, which was quite likely, considering its many uses. Beyond these fields, they entered a forest composed solely of the same tree species they had previously seen along the beach. There, they shot a new type of pigeon and spotted numerous especially shy parrots, likely due to the locals hunting them in their orchards. Eventually, they reached a hollowed-out path that seemed to have once been a rain gully, now completely dry and used by the locals as a footpath. Along the steep banks grew various bushes, some palm trees, and one enormous fig tree, Ficus religiosa, held sacred among the Sinhalese and Malabars. This tree had split its root into 2 main branches, one growing on one side of the path, the other on the opposite side, forming an arch across the trail. In its crown fluttered many small birds, clearly enjoying the abundance of fruit. They rested in the dense shade of the tree, and were pleased that several locals who passed by during this time showed no displeasure at their presence or the sound of gunshots. By noon, they started their journey back. Although it was very hot, the coolness of the shady forest kept them from feeling the heat too strongly. Near the water source, they met a local man cutting thin poles in the brush. He intended to use them to support the yam vines in his garden. His tool was a very primitive axe. The blade wasn't made of hard stone, but merely of a seashell. His progress was therefore very slow. Out of pity, they helped him using one of their English hatchets. Within minutes, they had cut more poles than he had managed all morning. Some locals, returning from the beach at midday, stopped by and marveled at the hatchet's great usefulness. A few immediately offered their bows and arrows in exchange. Because the interest was so strong, Georg and his companions even considered asking for a pig in return. But this proposal was ignored, and the people continued on their way. The piglet given to Georg's father by the old Pauvjangum remained the only one they received on the island. When they showed one of the wild nutmegs found in the pigeon's crop, a local gave them 3 more nuts of the same kind, still encased in their outer layer, the so-called mace. However, he could not point out the tree they came from. The nuts were known by different names among the islanders, but the tree was uniformly called Nirash. When Georg and the others looked it up in their botanical books, they found it resembled the wild nutmeg described by Rumphius, most likely the same species found in the Philippines. The pigeon that fed on these nuts in Tanna also closely resembled the bird described by Rumphius as spreading the true nutmeg on the Moluccas. Upon their return to England, they had the honor of presenting Her Majesty the Queen with a live specimen of this pigeon. Among the islanders gathered at the beach, Georg and his companions met an old, withered man none of them had seen before. The locals assured them he was their Eriki, a man named Jogai. He was tall, thin, emaciated, with an almost bald head and an iron-gray beard. His face bore much kindness, and despite its many wrinkles, traces of former beauty could still be seen. Next to him sat another man who, had the old man not been present, would also have been considered elderly. The locals said he was Jogai's son, named Jata. He was tall, well-built, and, by Tanna standards, unusually handsome. His expression was intelligent, open, and very friendly toward the strangers. What especially suited him was that he wore his almost woolly black hair naturally and unstyled. The locals called him Cow Wash, likely a title meaning heir, successor, or crown prince. In skin tone, these leaders did not differ from the other islanders, nor did their clothing or ornaments stand out, except for their belts, which were painted with white, red, and black fields and black stripes. Such sashes were usually one solid color, either yellow or cinnamon brown. This variation, however, seemed coincidental and not a special mark of royal dignity. Apart from being addressed as Eriki, the two received no special honors. Nor did they give any commands. Georg therefore suspected that their status mattered mostly in times of war. In such situations, many peoples had the custom of listening to the advice of a wise elder, giving his counsel the force of law, and entrusting him with their fortune and lives, provided his courage and experience were widely recognized. Georg and the others gave the two leaders some small gifts and invited them to accompany them to the ship. But the invitation was declined, so they returned alone to have lunch on board. That day, the crew brought back a large supply of casuarina wood, which they had cut on the high plateau. They had felled a fine tree of this kind. The reason was a crack they had discovered in their tiller, with no replacement available on board. So the captain intended to have a new tiller crafted from the trunk. As soon as the carpenters began sawing, Pauvjangum came straight to Captain Cook and complained about the felling. Casuarina trees were considered valuable on the island, and so rare that the locals had to fetch their clubs from Iromanga, where the wood was more common. Captain Cook immediately ordered the work to stop, but the trunk had already been cut so deep that the tree could no longer be saved. To make amends, the captain gave the old man a dog, a large quantity of Tahitian cloth, and various other items. In return, Pauvjangum and his family gave permission to take the tree. In this and other incidents, it became clear that Pauvjangum held great influence among the inhabitants of the Eastern Highlands. This likely stemmed from his venerable age, since the form of government still appeared to be at a very rudimentary level, namely patriarchal. Each family followed the advice of its elder, who in turn dared not abuse his position through harshness or arbitrary rule. After lunch, they went ashore again and into the forest, but found nothing new. This came as no surprise, since they had been exploring this very area almost daily since their arrival. The next morning, they set out to track down a nutmeg tree. In a beautiful banana grove at the western end of the beach, many parrots were feeding on the fruit. But they were so shy that, despite all efforts, the group couldn't get close enough. By now, they felt safe enough among the islanders to separate over longer distances. This was the case again on this day, without any incidents, but also without success. They returned to the beach empty-handed. The last boat was just about to leave for the ship at midday. They boarded and found the old Iriki or King Jogai, his son Jata, and a well-built 14-year-old boy named Narep already aboard, who appeared to be a close relative of the two. They had seated themselves on the floor of the cabin, while Captain Cook distributed various small gifts among them. Jogai received his share with age-typical indifference, while his son and Narep showed clear delight at the gifts. Meanwhile, the meal was served, and the guests joined in. They liked the yams very much, just as the guest Fanoko had earlier, but they didn't touch any of the other dishes. After the meal, they brought the visitors back to the beach. There, Jogai, Jata, and Narep immediately began speaking with their fellow islanders, likely reporting on the warm welcome they had received on board, which the bystanders clearly took great pleasure in hearing. By now, no more than about 100 locals, including women and children, would come to the beach. They usually sat in small groups under the shady trees. Occasionally, someone would bring a yam or a banana and trade it for Tahitian cloth. The women carried baskets full of jambo apples, Eugenia, which they sold for small trinkets, like black glass beads, little pieces of green nephrite, and similar items. It almost seemed as if they did this more out of kindness than for profit. On the whole, they were very courteous. When they encountered the researchers on narrow paths, they would step aside, often deep into the bushes, to make way. If they already knew the foreigners, they would call out their names and greet them warmly. If they met them for the first time, they asked for their names so they could recognize them next time. Given this peaceful atmosphere, the safety measure introduced at the beginning, rope lines set up to protect the sailors, hadn't been necessary for days. Instead, a single guard was posted. The islanders always stayed behind the line, unless someone came from the interior for the first time and wasn't yet aware of the rule. In short, during the short time of their stay, the people of Tanna had developed a much friendlier image of the foreigners and showed them increasing goodwill with each passing day. Shortly afterward, the distinguished guests Jogai, Jata, and Narep left the beach along with several others and returned through the forest to their dwellings, which, so Georg and the others assumed, lay deep within the island's interior. Once they had departed, Georg and the others accompanied the captain to the eastern mountain, where their men were to load ballast. While this was underway, they examined the nearby hot springs, which had been discovered during the first days of their stay. A Fahrenheit thermometer they brought for this purpose showed 25 degrees Celsius, 78 degrees Fahrenheit, on board, and had risen to about 28 degrees Celsius, 83 degrees Fahrenheit, from the body heat of the person carrying it. In this state, they dipped the bulb into the hot spring. After 5 minutes, the mercury had climbed to 88 degrees Celsius, 191 degrees Fahrenheit. They pulled it out again and dug a small hollow in the sand, so that the thermometer was covered by the water just a few centimeters above the bulb. Even in this position, it soon reached 88 degrees Celsius again, and didn't rise any further, not even after 10 minutes. A few small snails they tossed into the spring were fully cooked after 2 to 3 minutes. To find out whether the water would corrode metal, they placed a piece of silver in it. After half an hour, they retrieved it perfectly clean and gleaming. Even cream of tartar caused no visible change in the water. However, since the water had a slightly astringent taste, they filled a bottle with it to conduct further experiments later. At the beach, there were many small fish about 5 centimeters long that hopped across the wet rocks like lizards. Their pectoral fins served as feet, and their eyes were positioned almost in the middle of their heads, presumably to better spot predators while out of the water. These little amphibians were so cautious and quick that they were nearly impossible to catch. In the blink of an eye, they would leap over a meter away. Captain Cook had observed exactly this species, or at least a very similar one, on his earlier voyage along the coast of Australia. These fish belonged to the blenny family, Blenidae. Some of them were busily devouring a swarm of tiny crickets, Gryllus acata, which may have been washed out of a rock crevice by the sea. The next morning, they went out with the captain once more to examine the hot springs again, this time at low tide, since previous measurements had always been taken in the afternoon at high tide. The thermometer showed 25.5 degrees Celsius in open air and rose to 86.1 degrees Celsius in the hot water after just a minute and a half. The difference from the day before, when they had measured 88.3 degrees Celsius, struck them as especially curious, since the springs lay so close to the sea that they were flooded with salt water at high tide. In theory, this mixing should have cooled the spring water, but instead they observed the opposite, suggesting that the temperature of the springs must be influenced by other factors. This idea was supported by another spring at the western end of the large beach. It emerged from the black scoral sand at the base of a vertical rock face and flowed toward the sea, where it too was covered by salt water at high tide. The rock was part of the mountain with the Solfatara. In this spring, the thermometer rose to 94.7 degrees Celsius after 1 minute and held that temperature for several minutes. What caused this difference in temperature? Perhaps the springs came from underground channels near the volcano and only emerged near the shore. In that case, their temperature would depend on the mountain's internal heat, whose activity was known to fluctuate between eruptions. It was also possible that the water had to travel different distances underground and, depending on the path, lost more or less heat. Finally, they suspected a connection to the Solfatara, since both phenomena occurred at the same mountain. The shallow components might evaporate and escape as steam through cracks, while the remaining water cooled underground and eventually surfaced as a spring. All of this, however, remained speculation, for the volcano had been quiet for days, and there were no clear signs to confirm any theory.
For now, this part of the journey draws to a close. The route traced in this episode is available through the map linked in the show notes, where you can also explore how these places appear today. The story continues in the playlist or by subscribing to the channel, and those who wish to support the podcast will find the PayPal option there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.